Have you ever wondered if a single piece of kitchenware is a legitimate casus belli for a naval invasion between two European powers? Actually, in 1784, the answer was a soup pot, and the stakes were surprisingly soggy. The Holy Roman Emperor, Joseph II, was having a bit of a midlife crisis regarding his lack of maritime influence, specifically because the Dutch were blockading the Scheldt River. This river was the jugular vein of Antwerp's economy, and the Dutch had kept it closed for over a century just to be petty and maintain their own trade dominance. Joseph II, a man who loved a good enlightened reform but hated being told no, decided he'd had enough of the Dutch Republic's no-entry sign. He sent 3 ships, led by the flagship Le Louis, to sail down the river and prove that the Emperor of Austria didn't take orders from a bunch of tulip merchants. It was the geopolitical equivalent of driving your car through a neighbor's wet paint sign just to see if they'd actually call the cops.
Most expensive just passing through.
The Dutch, who took their river blocking very seriously, sent out a ship called the Dolphin to intercept the Emperor's little parade. When the 2 ships met, the Dutch captain did the 18th century version of freeze, but the Austrians kept sailing as if they were on a Sunday cruise. The Dutch then fired a single shot, a warning shot that would go down in history as the most accurate piece of slapstick comedy ever recorded. The cannonball didn't hit the hull, the mast, or the crew. Instead, it slammed directly into a large iron soup kettle sitting on the deck of Le Louis. It was a 1 in a million shot that resulted in the complete and total destruction of the crew's dinner, leaving the Austrians with a shattered pot and a lot of lukewarm broth on their boots.
Ramsay would have hated that service.
Upon seeing their soup kettle turned into shrapnel, the Austrian crew immediately surrendered, presumably because you can't fight a war on an empty stomach. Joseph II was absolutely livid when the news reached him, declaring that this was an insult to the imperial crown and a violation of international law. To the rest of Europe, however, it was the funniest thing to happen since the invention of the powdered wig. The war was instantly dubbed the Kettle War, or the Kettle War, and Joseph II became the laughingstock of every tavern from London to Vienna. It's hard to maintain an aura of imperial majesty when your military campaign is ended by the tactical demolition of a kitchen appliance.
Dinner is cancelled, and so is the empire.
Joseph II didn't just walk away, he did what any embarrassed world leader does. He overreacted. He mobilized an army, threatened a full-scale invasion of the Netherlands, and demanded that the Dutch pay him millions of guilders in compensation for the insult. The French, who were bored and looking for something to do, stepped in to mediate before the continent accidentally started a real war over a cooking utensil. Eventually, the Treaty of Fontainebleau was signed in 1785, where the Dutch agreed to pay Joseph a few million guilders to go away and stop talking about the river. Essentially, the Dutch Republic paid the emperor a massive shut-up fee so they could keep their river closed and their soup pots intact.
The most expensive pot ever sold.
The Dutch people, being the pragmatic merchants they are, thought this was a fantastic deal because they kept their monopoly on trade while the emperor looked like a clown. Joseph II, on the other hand, tried to spin the cash settlement as a victory, even though he failed to open the Scheldt and lost his dignity in the process. The Kettle War remains a masterclass in how small-scale incompetence can lead to large-scale diplomatic awkwardness. It proves that in the 18th century, you didn't need a massive casualty count to change history. You just needed a really bad day for a chef and a very accurate Dutch gunner.
5 stars for the aim.
If you look at the map of Europe today, the Scheldt is finally open, but it took another century and several much more violent wars to make it happen. Joseph II's attempt was the ultimate fail-fast startup of the military world, proving that logistics and morale are fragile things when soup is involved. The kettle itself didn't survive the encounter, but its legend lives on as a reminder that history isn't always written in blood. Sometimes, it's written in beef broth. It's the kind of story that makes you realize our ancestors were just as capable of being incredibly petty as we are today.
History's first viral fail video.
The war also highlighted the declining power of the Holy Roman Empire, which was becoming more holy and Roman in name only, while being empire not at all. Joseph II was trying to modernize a dying system, but he kept tripping over the shoelaces of old European treaties. Every time he tried to exert power, he ended up in a situation like the Kettle War, where the reality of his weakness was exposed by a single cannonball. It's a tragicomedy about a man who wanted to be great, but ended up being the guy who lost a fight to a Dutch pantry.
Greatness is hard. Soup is harder.
Meanwhile, the Dutch Republic was also on its last legs, facing internal revolts and an eventual invasion by the French a few years later. The Kettle War was like the final comedic sketch before the dark drama of the Napoleonic Wars began. It was a moment of levity in a century that was otherwise obsessed with bayonet charges and colonizing everything that wasn't nailed down. Even the soldiers involved probably went home and told their grandkids that they fought in the Great Kitchenware Campaign of '84.
I survived the soup siege.
The Treaty of Fontainebleau might have settled the bill, but it didn't settle the ego of the Austrian court, which stayed grumpy about the Dutch for decades. This pettiness would eventually contribute to the shifting alliances that led to even bigger messes across the continent. It's a classic example of the butterfly effect, except instead of a butterfly, it's a cast iron pot. One shot at a kettle in 1784 ripples through time until someone finally writes a sarcastic script about it in 2026.
Don't mess with the chef.
Today, the Scheldt River is a peaceful waterway, and nobody is shooting at kettles anymore, which is a significant upgrade for everyone's lunch plans. The story serves as a reminder that nationalism can make people do very stupid things for very little gain. If Joseph II had just stayed home and ordered takeout, he would have saved himself millions of guilders and a lot of embarrassment. But then again, we wouldn't have this ridiculous story to talk about while we wait for our own soup to heat up.
Check the no-fly zone.
In the end, the Kettle War is the perfect metaphor for human conflict. High tempers, expensive equipment, and a result that leaves everyone feeling a bit confused and slightly hungry. It shows that even the most powerful people in the world are susceptible to the absurdity of chance and the power of a well-placed warning shot. Robert Jenkins had his ear, and Joseph II had his pot, proving that human history is basically just a series of escalations over lost property.
Worst kitchen renovation project ever.
So next time you accidentally break a dish in the kitchen, just remember that you didn't trigger a diplomatic crisis or a multi-million-dollar treaty negotiation. You're doing better than an 18th century emperor, and your soup is probably still edible. History is full of these bruh moments, and the Kettle War sits right at the top of the pantry of shame.
Modern problems require modern ladles.
If you enjoyed this absurd chapter of human history, don't forget to like and subscribe. Click the top left video to explore another unbelievable historical failure. We'll see you in the next disaster. Thanks for watching.